So as you know, I'm an Ayaka theory crafter, and this title is actually not clickbait. And it looks like free-to-play Ayaka did actually get a pretty crazy buff with this new region. It's this new craftable weapon, Finale of the Deep. And especially if you get it to max refine, it just gives so much more attack than Amonoma Kageuchi. The catch is that you do need a strong healer. You can get the recipe for Finale of the Deep in the new Fontaine smithing area. You just need to get all these new materials in the overworld. So how does the weapon work? I'm going to simplify things. Basically, you do your team setup as normal, and then when your Ayaka uses her skill, it gives you the first attack buff, and then you get this temporary Bond of Life debuff worth 25% of a HP, and then your healer heals this amount, and then you get the second attack buff. And by the time your elemental burst is cast, it will enjoy tons of buffs. As you might know, the burst does snapshot buffs, but it's very late into the animation that it does, so you get plenty of time. The cool thing is that this weapon's buffs last 15 seconds, which is more than enough for your Ayaka. Just know you'll get the debuff again when you use her skill again during the battery part of your rotations. Also watch out because you can't properly heal her until you clear this debuff. So how strong is the weapon? I'll show you my calculations. So this is my Ayaka weapon calc sheet. I'll put the link in the video description. Basically this new weapon, depending on the buffs you have, seems to be in between Mistsplitter and Amonoma, which is very good. If I made any small errors in this calc, I'll update the sheet, but basically I think it's as strong as all the other 5-star swords. And actually it can be better since some of these other calcs are pretty generous. With Haran and Jade Cutter in freeze teams, you have to avoid overcapping on crit rate, and so you can say Finale of the Deep kind of gives similar attack to Summit Shaper. You can also see, even without getting the full buff and not clearing the life bond, it's still an upgrade over Amonoma. So how is the weapon so strong? Basically, as I said, it gives so much attack, and you can see it's a lot more than Amonoma Kageuchi. And even though Amonoma allows you to not need as much energy recharge on your builds, that's kind of all it really does. Whereas with Finale of the Deep, honestly, the extra attack is worth it, even if you have to build more ER now. So for example, if with Amonoma you only needed 100 or maybe 111 energy recharge like in this calc, because in standard calcs we have 2 substats as mandatory, then Finale of the Deep is basically built just like Mistsplitter, where you probably builded instead 140 energy recharge. The other advantage it has over Amonoma is obviously the higher base attack. This means it utilizes attack percent buffs like TTDS, Noblesse or Tenacity better than Amonoma. For example, you can see here I get about 50 more attack from the 48% TTDS buff. So as for teammates, Kokomi is perfect for this weapon in general. And that's pretty good to hear because she was already a teammate. I'm sure most of you already play with Ayaka anyway. And besides her, I did test Diona and she seems to work relatively well if you build her healing good enough. So I'd say most of your level 90 Ayaka builds probably have around 18 to 20k HP. Meaning if you read this weapon's passive, it uses 25% of a HP. Meaning Ayaka needs a healer to heal about 5k HP for the full buff. I tested a bunch of different Kokomi builds and I overhealed with a level 90 TTDS. It was still fine with the unleveled TTDS, and even when I switched from a healing bonus circlet to just a HP one, it was still fine. I also tested different setup combos because I wanted to check how consistent getting the buff in time was. On Ayaka, I tried N1 skill burst, skill N1 burst, just using skill and burst. And it does seem you get plenty of time regardless to make sure Kokomi's healing ticks in time. However, as I'll cover later, if you haven't healed properly and you end up stacking multiple Bond of Life debuffs, you can run into issues. I also did testing on Diona. You can see my build, she isn't maxed out. So as you can see, if I use ER Sands instead of HP, or I used HP instead of a healing bonus on her circlet, her healing might not be as good as Kokomi's. And you can see I kind of have to even rely on this C6 healing buff. So if you aren't low HP to benefit from this C6, you could run into issues, but I'd say overall your Dionas do need to be well built. especially in comparison to Kokomi's builds, where I think you can get away with more scuffed builds. For other healers, unfortunately, you can't really get away with Mona on Prototype Amber. The burst healing is just a lot less than Kokomi's. However, on this, to be honest, I wouldn't be surprised if a lot of people who play Ayaka, Mona, Shenhe, Kazuha without a healer already have Mistsplitter anyway. So for you guys, I guess you won't really care about this weapon anyway. And obviously, Bennett's healing stops working when you're above 70% HP, so he isn't going to work that well with this weapon either. One issue I did notice with the weapon, as with all healers, is if you end up stacking the debuff more than once and you didn't heal it off in between, maybe an enemy pushed you out of Kokomi's jellyfish range at some point, or you have to move to a different part of the map to fight new spawning enemies, you can have an issue like this. What this issue is you won't get the full buff again until you fully clear off this debuff. So even with Kokomi, you can end up needing to take more than one healing tick, so you have to play around that. But however, I would say that the good thing about Kokomi is that her healing jellyfish lasts 12 seconds. And since if you're doing the setups right, you probably use her just before switching to Ayaka. This means she can be able to heal even when you use Ayaka's skill again in the second half of your rotations. So as long as you're still fighting around the jellyfish and you use Ayaka's skill quickly when it's available, you can pretty confidently avoid this issue of stacking the debuff multiple times. So overall, the weapon is pretty great. Just don't expect it to be as strong as Mistsplitter. That's an insane weapon, and obviously you have to put this buff into context. As you know, Ayaka is considered a hyper carry, and in her popular teams you guys play, she deals most of your team's damage. So her getting a new weapon and getting a buff like this is almost a buff to your entire team's overall damage. So if you were using Amnoma before, obviously you'll have to switch up your builds a bit to get more energy recharge, but your damage now should be fairly noticeably better. Also, I guess it does make those HP stats in your artifacts a bit more useful now too. The only bad thing about this weapon is farming these crystals can take a long time, especially if you're going for max refines. You have to do this 5 times, and you have to do a lot of swimming underwater for these crystals in particular. I'm just stopping at refined 1 myself. Obviously I already have Mistsplitter, so I don't really need this outside of this video. Also, if you did want an in-game damage comparison alongside my calcs, then sorry, I'm trying to save all my fragile resins for whenever I get a new character. Also, I'm spending a lot of my resin at the moment for these new artifacts. I want to stay ahead of the game if a new character comes out and they end up using some of these pieces, so I don't want to use my resin too much either. Anyway, hopefully you found this video helpful, and thanks for watching.